was a sunlit afternoon in St. Mary Mead, the kind of day that seemed to encourage nothing more ambitious than sipping tea and watching the world go by. The well-tended gardens of Gable House were alive with color. Roses clung to trellises like delicate flames, and hydrangeas swayed gently in the breeze. Lady Brabazon, a widow of some means and boundless energy, had taken it upon herself to host the village's annual midsummer garden party, a tradition that was now entering its 23rd year. Guests arrived in a polite stream, each greeting the other with the sort of cordiality that masked subtle rivalries and unspoken resentments. Mr. Jonathan Haversham, a prosperous banker with a fondness for bow ties, was already perched beneath a parasol, debating the merits of rose fertilizers with Mrs. Penelope Curd, who insisted she knew better than any professional gardener. Children ran between the flower beds, and the scent of freshly baked scones mingled with the fragrance of lavender in the air. Miss Jane Marple, recently returned from a short visit to her nephew Raymond's household in London, had accepted Lady Brabazon's invitation out of both civility and curiosity. Standing quietly at the edge of the gathering, she observed with calm scrutiny. There was something about the ease with which villagers concealed their irritations behind polite smiles that always fascinated her. The event progressed without incident until the clock struck 4. That was when Mr. Basil Langley, a man known for his impeccable manners and the occasional sly remark, rose from his chair and made for the small drinks table, where Lady Brabazon herself had been pouring sherry and lemonade. Moments later, a shrill scream cut across the gardens. Guests turned to see Mr. Langley convulsing, clutching at his throat and collapsing to the ground. Panic erupted. The children shrieked and were hurried away, while the adults crowded around, some attempting to render assistance, others frozen in shock. Lady Brabazon dropped her teacup with a clatter and covered her mouth with a gloved hand by the time the village doctor, summoned in a flurry of urgent messages, arrived. It was too late. Mr. Basil Langley was dead. His once impeccable attire was now rumpled, his face a peculiar shade of greenish-gray, and his hands trembled as though still grasping something unseen. It was, to all appearances, a sudden and inexplicable tragedy. Yet Miss Marple, calm and composed as ever, felt a small but insistent ripple of curiosity stir within her. There was something in the way the man had fallen, the way the crowd had reacted, that hinted at more than mere accident or sudden illness. And so, the quiet village of St. Mary Mead had, in a single, shocking moment, become the scene of a puzzle only Miss Marple's keen mind might hope to unravel. The news of Mr. Basil Langley's sudden death spread through St. Mary Mead faster than the summer breeze through the hedgerows. By late afternoon, nearly every inhabitant who was not at the garden party had heard, in varying detail, of the shocking event. As is customary in small villages, speculation ran rampant, and the theories offered were as numerous as they were implausible. Mrs. Curd, who had insisted she had the finest roses in the county, was particularly vocal in her assessment. It must have been something he ate. That man was always nibbling on exotic things. I saw him eyeing my homemade apricot tart with too much interest, she insisted, her sharp gaze sweeping the crowd. Mr. Haversham, adjusting his bow tie with the precision of a man who lived for order, disagreed. No, it was far more serious than a mere tart. I suspect, though I cannot say why, that it might have been something in the sherry. His words carried a weight, for he was always careful in speech, never given to rash conjecture. Even among those who had barely noticed the garden party, there arose whispers of long-standing rivalries and grudges. Old Mr. Jenkins, a retired solicitor, suggested that Basil Langley's sudden demise might be a consequence of some hidden debt or financial misstep. That man was clever. But clever men make enemies, he murmured, shaking his head, as though he alone could divine the complicated web of fiscal entanglements in the village. Amidst all this speculation, Miss Marple remained in her usual corner, quietly observing. She noted the little things, how Lady Brabazon's face, though pale, betrayed a flicker of annoyance rather than grief. How Mr. Haversham's hands, though steady, twitched ever so slightly when he spoke of the sherry. How Mrs. Curd's eyes darted toward her own carefully arranged pastries as if to claim some moral superiority in hygiene or propriety. These were subtle indicators, but to Miss Marple, they were as informative as any spoken word. The coroner, Dr. Felix Crawley, arrived by early evening, carrying with him a small leather case of instruments and an expression of polite disapproval at being called out on such a sunny day. After a brief examination of the body, he declared that an autopsy would be necessary, noting that the cause of death was unusual and sudden. Though he refrained from offering any definitive explanation at that point, by the following morning, the village was alive with murmured conversations. At the post office, two women exchanged observations over letters and parcels. "Did you hear about Basil Langley?" One whispered, her voice low, as though the mere mention of the man's name could conjure calamity. "I hear it might have been poison." "Poison?" her companion gasped. But who would do such a thing in broad daylight, at Lady Brabazon's garden party? The answer, of course, was unknown, and the uncertainty only fueled the intrigue. Miss Marple, having listened to these exchanges, reflected on the nature of gossip. People often revealed more about themselves than about the events they described, and there was truth to be gleaned if one could sift through the exaggerations and half-truths. Later that afternoon, she visited the Langley residence under the pretense of offering condolences. The house was a comfortable, understated home that bore the marks of careful curation rather than ostentation. Basil's widow, Eleanor, received her with a strained smile, her hands trembling slightly as she offered tea. "I cannot imagine who would do such a thing," Mrs. Langley said, her voice soft but edged with tension. "He was, well, difficult at times, yes, but who would wish him dead?" Her eyes, however, betrayed a different story. There was no tearful mourning, only a thinly veiled impatience, as if the interruption to her life was more grievous than the loss itself. Miss Marple noted the subtle shift of her gaze whenever she mentioned her husband, the way her lips pressed together, and the faint tremor in her hands as she poured tea as she departed. Miss Marple considered the collection of villagers she had encountered, the anxious, the self-important, the secretive. Each had their own relationship with Basil Langley, each a potential source of motive or misdirection. There was, for example, young Emily Pritchard, whose engagement Basil had allegedly opposed, and the seemingly mild-mannered Mr. Wilkins, whose debts to the deceased were whispered about in corners of the village where polite ears could not reach. Even Lady Brabazon, whose garden party had been marred, carried in her heart a combination of pride and irritation that Miss Marple catalogued with careful attention. The detective work in St. Mary Mead would, Miss Marple realized, require patience and subtlety. She would need to listen, observe, and gently prod the villagers, watching not for dramatic confessions, but for the faintest tremors of truth in conversation and demeanor. A dropped word, a momentary glance, a habitual gesture, these would be the breadcrumbs leading to the heart of the mystery by evening. The village had settled into an uneasy routine, yet a palpable tension lingered in the air. Windows were opened as though to breathe in clarity, doors were double-locked for comfort, and every familiar path seemed to carry the shadow of suspicion. Miss Marple, sitting in her cozy armchair back at home, allowed herself a quiet smile. The village, serene on the surface, held secrets that would soon begin to reveal themselves to those with the eyes to see. And Miss Marple, with her gentle patience and sharp mind, intended to be among the first to unravel the truth as the lamps flickered on in the twilight, and the quiet hum of the village evening rose. It was clear that St. Mary Mead had entered a new chapter, one where innocence was only a mask and the subtle art of observation might be the only key to justice. The following morning brought a crispness to St. Mary Mead that seemed to sharpen every sound and gesture. Miss Marple, having spent a contemplative evening reviewing the impressions she had gathered at the garden party and from her visits to the Langley residence, resolved to take her first steps in a quiet, deliberate investigation. She did not rush. In her experience, the truth often presented itself not through interrogation or formal procedure, but through careful observation and the subtleties of human behavior. Her first call was upon Mrs. Penelope Curd, whose garden bordered the Langleys. The older woman, ever eager for company, welcomed her with a readiness that suggested she had been expecting some visitor. Tea was served, and Mrs. Curd, speaking with the unrestrained enthusiasm of a village gossip, recounted the events of the previous day in considerable detail, punctuating her account with her own interpretations. Honestly, Jane, it was ghastly, she said, wringing her hands over the fine china cup. Basil Langley, falling like that. I never saw anything so dreadful. And to think it could have been something as simple as the sherry. Miss Marple sipped her tea gently, letting the words hang in the air. She asked questions only sparingly, phrasing them in such a way that they seemed more like idle curiosity than deliberate inquiry. The sherry, you say? She murmured. It was poured from the usual bottle, I presume? Indeed, Mrs. Curd replied. From the very bottle Lady Brabazon keeps for her guests. I even remarked how nicely it had been chilled. She paused, then added with a twinkle of suspicion, though, of course, we can never tell what secrets a man might hide in a bottle. Miss Marple noted the slight shiver that passed through Mrs. Curd's hand as she replaced the teacup. It was subtle, but in conjunction with the rest of the scene, it indicated either fear or anticipation, perhaps a mixture of both from. There, Miss Marple wandered the village, speaking quietly with anyone willing to indulge her, observing the faces of those she met more than their words. At the post office, she saw young Emily Pritchard, whose engagement to a distant cousin of Basil Langley had been the source of mild scandal and considerable private disappointment. Emily's hands were trembling, her gaze shifting nervously whenever the conversation touched upon the late Mr. Langley. When Miss Marple asked after her day, Emily said only, "It is a terrible shock for everyone." Yet her voice carried a subtle note of relief, as though some burden had lifted along with the man's demise. Further along, Miss Marple called upon Mr. Wilkins, a quiet, unassuming man whose modest home bore signs of careful attention despite his limited means. He was cooperative enough, but his nervous glances and the way he fidgeted with the edge of his coat revealed a man carrying some hidden concern. "I cannot imagine why anyone would wish Mr. Langley ill," he said. He was strict, yes, but fair enough. I only wish I had known him better." The contradiction between his words and his demeanor did not escape Miss Marple. Indeed, it drew her attention rather than lessened it. As the day progressed, Miss Marple visited the scene of the incident at Gable House, walking through the garden and noting details overlooked by those who had been present in the heat of panic. The parasol beneath which Mr. Langley had stood still bore a faint, sticky residue, likely from the spillage of his drink, but nothing more outwardly sinister. Yet Miss Marple's mind lingered on small things: the precise angle at which he had collapsed, the slight disturbance in the flower beds where children had run, and the absence of any sign that he had struggled. There was a deliberateness in the fall, she considered, though the meaning of it remained elusive. That evening, she returned to her own home, a modest cottage that had long been her observation post in the village. By the fire, she reflected on the collection of impressions gathered during the day. Each encounter had left her with fragments of behavior, glances, gestures, nuances of tone that, while individually insignificant, collectively hinted at the complex web surrounding Basil Langley. Miss Marple knew that the villagers' outward composure often masked deeper, more telling truths. She also considered Lady Brabazon, whose serene manner had barely masked irritation and impatience. The host's meticulous attention to order and propriety, combined with an unmistakable pride in her social gatherings, suggested that anyone who disrupted her carefully constructed environment could easily become a target of subtle resentment. Likewise, the children's absent-minded footprints in the flower beds offered no more than a clue to distraction. But even small details could reveal patterns if traced with care. By nightfall, the village seemed quieter than usual, though not entirely calm. Doors were locked, shutters closed, and conversations became whispers, carrying hints of suspicion and unease. Yet Miss Marple felt no rush to precipitate action. Investigation, she knew, was a matter of patience as much as perception. The first day had offered her impressions. The following days, she was certain, would allow the pieces to fall into place. Sitting before her fire, she mused over the subtle incongruities that had presented themselves. The relief in Emily Pritchard's demeanor, Mr. Wilkins's unease, Mrs. Curd's performance of horror tinged with curiosity, and Lady Brabazon's quiet vexation. Each behavior, observed in its context, was a thread in the larger tapestry of the village's hidden tensions. And somewhere within that tapestry lay the explanation for Basil Langley's untimely death, a truth that would, in due course, emerge. Through careful attention to the nuances of human behavior, rather than through dramatic evidence or confession. Miss Marple poured herself a cup of tea, smiling faintly. The investigation had begun in earnest, but the real work, uncovering motive, deciphering pretense, and revealing the human complexities that led to murder, was only just beginning. And she, with her accustomed patience and acute perception, would follow every thread, unnoticed by those who believed themselves shrewd, until the entire picture became unmistakably clear. By mid-morning, the police had arrived in St. Mary Mead. Though their presence did little to calm the villagers, who now oscillated between fear and curiosity. Inspector Davis, a capable man with an unhurried manner and a penchant for procedure, assumed the role of lead investigator. He spoke firmly but politely, taking statements from those present at the garden party, while maintaining an air of professional detachment. Yet it was clear that, despite his diligence, the investigation was guided largely by the most obvious clues rather than subtle behavioral cues. Miss Marple observed quietly from a distance, noting the dynamics between the inspector and the villagers. Those who were most vocal in their theories were often least reliable in their testimony. The more anxious an individual seemed to appear, the more likely they were to overemphasize trivial details. Miss Marple had learned over many years that it was in these very exaggerations that one could find the seeds of truth. Attention quickly fell upon Emily Pritchard, whose engagement to a relative of Basil Langley had been strained. Her presence at the party and her nervous demeanor made her an easy target for suspicion. She had cause, one villager whispered to another, and she looked positively relieved after he passed away. Emily, naturally, was distraught and protested her innocence, but the pattern of her behavior drew murmurs that Inspector Davis was careful to note. Miss Marple, however, discerned nuances in Emily's expressions that suggested relief was not born of malice, but of long-standing anxiety and familial pressure. Another suspect emerged in the form of Mr. Wilkins, the quiet, mild-mannered man whose debts to the deceased were known by a select few. Though he protested vigorously, insisting he had no reason to harm Mr. Langley, the police viewed his financial entanglements as motive enough to warrant close scrutiny. Miss Marple, conversely, saw in his demeanor a mixture of fear and shame rather than guilt. Understanding that the visible anxiety of a man pressed by circumstance could easily be mistaken for the marks of a murderer, Lady Brabazon, the hostess, found herself in a peculiar position. Though entirely innocent of any wrongdoing, she had a natural tendency to command attention, and her exacting standards during the garden party were often recounted with slight exaggeration by those present. Some began to speculate whether her impatience with the guest list and her pride in the event might have driven her to extremes. Miss Marple noted, with quiet amusement, the way Lady Brabazon's eyes flickered with irritation whenever anyone questioned the arrangement of her flowers or the placement of chairs. It was a minor detail, yet to Miss Marple it suggested that her preoccupations were aesthetic rather than criminal. The police also interviewed Mrs. Penelope Curd, whose earlier speculations had painted her as an anxious observer with a penchant for gossip. She repeated her account of the sherry, her emphasis on the apricot tart, and her observations of Basil Langley's last moments. Miss Marple noticed the faint pride in her tone, as though she were pleased to offer an opinion that might prove relevant. The detective understood that individuals such as Mrs. Curd often revealed their own perceptions and fears in the guise of reporting facts. As the day unfolded, Miss Marple began her own quiet inquiries. She visited the kitchen at Gable House, speaking with the servants who had been tasked with preparing the refreshments. Their accounts were straightforward but contained subtle discrepancies. One young maid mentioned that Mr. Langley had requested a second glass of sherry, while another recalled seeing him linger near the table longer than was typical for polite consumption. These observations, seemingly trivial, would later gain significance in the context of the unfolding mystery. By evening, Miss Marple sat in her armchair, sipping tea and reviewing the events of the day. Each suspect she had observed carried with them layers of behavior, anxiety, resentment, pride, or distraction, all woven together into a tapestry that obscured the truth. The challenge lay in separating authentic indicators from misdirection. She reflected on the ease with which Inspector Davis and the villagers had gravitated toward the obvious suspects. The anxious young woman, the indebted man, the imperious hostess, each fitted neatly into a narrative constructed by common assumptions. But Miss Marple's experience taught her that the truth often lay beneath the surface, in the minor gestures, the fleeting expressions, and the behavior that seemed incongruous with stated emotion. And so, as the night settled over St. Mary Mead, the investigation remained open, the threads of suspicion numerous and tangled. Miss Marple, however, felt no rush, confident that the patterns would soon reveal themselves to one with the patience to observe and the discernment to interpret. The first wave of suspicion had settled upon the obvious targets, but she knew that the true perpetrator often hides in plain sight, camouflaged by social niceties and the village's polite indifference. With a quiet sense of anticipation, she prepared herself for the days ahead. There would be interviews, small discoveries, and moments of inadvertent revelation from the villagers themselves. And in that gradual, meticulous process, Miss Marple would begin to untangle the subtle threads that led to the heart of Basil Langley's demise, a web spun not through violence alone, but through the intricate interplay of human behavior, resentment, and secret ambition. Miss Marple rose early the following morning, as was her habit, and took her customary walk along the village paths before the heat of the day settled over St. Mary Mead. There was a clarity to these morning hours, a silence punctuated only by birdsong and the distant calls of early workers, that allowed her mind to sift through observations collected over the previous days. Something, she felt, had been overlooked, not in the obvious testimonies, but in the subtle interplay of details that everyone assumed were inconsequential. Her attention first returned to the scene at Gable House, retracing the steps of the garden party. She paused near the spot where Basil Langley had collapsed, noting once again the uneven tiling beneath the parasol and the slight scattering of petals that had gone unnoticed amid the panic. What drew her eye, however, was a small, irregular stain on the edge of the serving table, a discoloration on the white linen that, at a glance, might have seemed only a drip from the sherry. But the pattern was peculiar. It was localized and oddly viscous, as though some substance had been deliberately placed there rather than spilled in the ordinary course of serving. Intrigued, Miss Marple returned to the kitchen, speaking discreetly with the housekeeper. Mrs. Hawkins, the woman, polite yet protective of her domain, explained the arrangement of the table and the sequence of serving. Miss Marple listened carefully, nodding and asking questions about the order in which the drinks were offered, who touched the bottles, and the placement of each glass. Mrs. Hawkins's account was precise, yet it contained subtle contradictions. She could not entirely recall whether the sherry bottle had been in its usual position or briefly moved closer to the host's side of the table. With these small but suggestive details in mind, Miss Marple turned her attention to the guests. She considered the glasses of sherry each had taken, the angles at which they had been held, and the brief pauses of conversation during which a hand might have lingered unnoticed. She noted, too, the faces of the attendees, the way Emily Pritchard had avoided the table after the first sip, the nervous adjustment of Mr. Wilkins's cuff, the meticulous care with which Lady Brabazon maintained her posture and composure. All these observations she catalogued mentally, aware that human behavior often betrayed intention in the most fleeting of moments. Later that afternoon, she made her way to the post office, ostensibly to send a letter, but in truth to eavesdrop, gently, with the innocence of a casual shopper, on the conversations of those who could not resist discussing the case. Villagers speculated endlessly. Some emphasized the suspicious behavior of Emily, others the financial motives of Mr. Wilkins, and still others the temperamental pride of Lady Brabazon. Yet in all these accounts, Miss Marple detected an absence, a gap in the narrative where a subtle but decisive clue might lie hidden. It was on returning home that the realization began to coalesce. She remembered the small, irregular stain on the tablecloth, the unusual positioning of the glasses, and the seemingly inconsequential remark of Mrs. Hawkins about the sherry being slightly off that day. Nothing overt, nothing to warrant immediate alarm. Yet together they suggested a deliberate act executed with care and an understanding of human distraction. The manner of the death, the sudden collapse. The absence of struggle was consistent with ingestion of a subtle poison, delivered quietly and unnoticed. Miss Marple's mind then turned to the psychology of the perpetrator. Whoever had carried out the act had relied upon the assumptions of the crowd, that the drink would be consumed without question, that attention would be elsewhere. That human behavior, predictable, habitual, and easily distracted, would conceal their hand. She smiled faintly, for this was characteristic of someone clever yet complacent, confident in the belief that no one would notice the smallest misalignment of gesture or timing. That evening, she called upon Mrs. Penelope Curd once more, under the pretext of discussing gardening techniques. In conversation, Miss Marple allowed her questions to drift gently toward the garden party itself, observing Mrs. Curd's responses with acute attention. The older woman, though voluble and certain in her own recollections, displayed a subtle hesitation when asked about the sequence of serving the drinks. Miss Marple noted it carefully. A small pause, a flicker of uncertainty, a detail that might otherwise have been dismissed. By the time Miss Marple returned to her armchair at dusk, she had begun to form a clearer picture. The true significance of the small, seemingly inconsequential details, the stain, the positioning of glasses, the manner in which the guests were distracted, was emerging. The death of Basil Langley had been deliberate, carefully orchestrated, and executed with an understanding of human expectation and oversight. The threads were faint but present, requiring only careful tracing to reveal the hidden pattern. Sitting quietly with her tea, Miss Marple reflected on the layers of deception, the distractions, the misdirections, and the superficial assumptions of motive. Each piece of the puzzle had begun to interlock in her mind, though the full picture remained just out of reach. She was patient. She knew that the next few days would bring the subtle revelations, the inadvertent slips, and the inconsistencies that would ultimately illuminate the mind behind the act. The clue that everyone else had overlooked was hers alone, waiting for the right moment to unfold into the truth. The days that followed the garden party were charged with a quiet tension, the kind that seemed to hover over St. Mary Mead, unnoticed yet palpably present. Villagers went about their routines with deliberate care, avoiding overt discussion of the events. Yet in the shadows of polite conversation, secrets began to surface. Miss Marple, ever patient, continued her unobtrusive observation, recognizing that human nature had a peculiar way of revealing itself when one least expected. It began with Emily Pritchard, who, despite her outward composure, could not fully conceal her apprehension. Miss Marple found her one afternoon in the small village library, ostensibly reading, yet her eyes kept flicking to the doorway, as if awaiting some unspoken reckoning. Gentle conversation drew Emily out, and in her words emerged hints of private resentment, grievances against Basil Langley for the constraints he had imposed on her engagement and the suffocating pressure he had brought to bear on her family. While these grievances were real, Miss Marple noted the subtle difference between moral indignation and lethal intent. Emily's irritation was the kind that bred tears or avoidance, not the meticulous plotting of murder at the same time. Mr. Wilkins, who had seemed so reticent during initial interviews, began to show signs of strain. Financial entanglements, though minor in the larger scheme, weighed heavily upon him, and villagers who had long whispered of his debts now watched him with thinly veiled suspicion. Miss Marple observed that while he was indeed worried, there was no evidence of premeditation or skill in deception. The nervous fidgeting, the careful choice of words, all betrayed a man anxious about exposure rather than a calculated murderer. Lady Brabazon, meanwhile, proved a more subtle study. Her attention to appearances, her insistence on decorum, and the faint traces of irritation she displayed over trivial matters all hinted at a personality accustomed to controlling her environment. In private, Miss Marple learned, she harbored a history of rivalry with the Langley family that was less about personal animus than about status and influence within the village. It was the kind of tension that could easily appear sinister if viewed without context. Yet Miss Marple's careful scrutiny revealed the underlying truth. Lady Brabazon's concerns were entirely aesthetic and social, not homicidal. The housekeeper, Mrs. Hawkins, offered another layer of insight. During casual conversation, she mentioned Basil Langley's fondness for minor indulgences, an unusual brand of confection. a specific blend of sherry, a preference for certain herbal teas, and how these tastes had occasionally led to small domestic quarrels. Miss Marple listened attentively, noting the ordinary human nature behind these preferences. Yet she filed away a small detail that might have seemed trivial to anyone else. A rare, imported substance Basil had insisted on keeping separate from the main supplies. It was the combination of these small revelations, gathered through quiet observation and patient conversation, that allowed Miss Marple to begin weaving together a fuller picture. The death was not the product of casual accident, nor of blind passion, but of a carefully executed plan reliant upon human expectation and distraction. The murderer had known the habits of the guests, their attention spans, and the order of service. They had relied upon the predictable nature of social etiquette to conceal the act.by the evening. Miss Marple had begun a series of subtle tests, gently questioning villagers in a manner designed to reveal inconsistencies without arousing suspicion. A passing comment about the arrangement of the sherry bottles, an offhand query regarding Basil's last movements. Each produced small reactions, slight changes in posture, the faintest shift in tone, that she catalogued with meticulous care. These were the threads of truth, and they would soon begin to converge. In reflecting on these interactions, she considered the psychological profile required to orchestrate such an event: precision, patience, and an intimate understanding of social dynamics. The person responsible would need to be confident, clever, and capable of concealing intent behind the mask of civility. They would not rely on overt threats or violence, but on the subtler arts of misdirection and timing. As night fell, Miss Marple returned to the comfort of her armchair, the fire casting a gentle glow across the room. The villagers' secrets had begun to surface, not as confessions, but as behaviors, small gestures, and subtle tensions. Every action, every slip of the tongue, every concealed irritation was a thread waiting to be traced back to its source. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully, her mind piecing together the mosaic of human behavior surrounding Basil Langley's death. The confrontation with motives, grudges, and fears had begun in earnest. And though the ultimate resolution was not yet visible, she felt a growing certainty that the next steps, if approached with patience and acute observation, would soon reveal the identity of the one who had manipulated circumstance so skillfully to conceal a deadly intent beneath the veneer. Of a summer garden party, the calm of St. Mary, Mead was disrupted one morning by a new, entirely unexpected development. A letter, anonymous and unsigned, arrived at the post office, its contents brief yet unsettling. Look closely at what everyone believes is obvious. The truth is far subtler than you imagine. The message, while cryptic, caused a ripple of unease throughout the village. It was not threatening, yet it suggested that someone, whether with insight or malice, was watching the proceedings closely. Miss Marple, upon hearing of the letter, did not rush to speculate on its origin. She simply noted its existence, as one does a quiet symptom of an illness, small, easily overlooked, yet potentially significant. Later that day, a second minor but curious incident occurred. A tray of pastries, left overnight in the kitchen of Gable House, was found disturbed. Nothing had been stolen, yet crumbs were scattered, and the edge of the tablecloth, precisely where Mr. Langley had last stood, was slightly shifted. The servants were puzzled, suggesting only that the cat, if it had been allowed, might have leapt upon the table. Miss Marple, however, regarded the scene with her usual careful eye. The shift was too deliberate, too precise for the antics of a feline. Someone had been there, moving through the space with knowledge of its layout, conscious of what could be seen and what would remain unnoticed. These events, taken together, caused the village to whisper anew. Was there a second person involved in Basil Langley's death? Or was the author of the letter attempting to misdirect attention, to play with the villagers' fears? Inspector Davis, ever methodical, found no evidence of intrusion or tampering. Yet he acknowledged the difficulty in dismissing the psychological impact of such provocations. Miss Marple, quietly observing from her vantage, noted the layers of deception, the mixture of truth, misdirection, and the villagers' own anxieties that were now beginning to tangle together. That afternoon, she revisited the Langley home, ostensibly to offer a further condolence. but more subtly to observe interactions among the household and their acquaintances. She noted Eleanor Langley's careful management of her emotions, a precise control over gestures, a faint twitch when the sherry bottle was mentioned, and a watchfulness over servants that suggested both vigilance and awareness of appearances. There was nothing overtly suspicious, yet her control over minute details reflected a mind attuned to observation, capable of orchestrating events without drawing attention. Miss Marple's attention next fell upon Emily Pritchard. In conversation, the young woman revealed a lingering tension with her family, a pressure to maintain propriety, and a desire to see certain obligations fulfilled. Emily's words were heartfelt, yet measured, revealing both innocence and the natural relief of freedom from a domineering influence. Basil Langley. Miss Marple's observations confirmed what she had suspected. Relief at the death did not equate to culpability. That it was the brief encounter with Mrs. Penelope Curd, however, that proved most illuminating. Under the pretext of discussing the flowers, Miss Marple observed a subtle hesitation when the conversation drifted toward the garden party and the sequence of serving drinks. A slight tremor in Mrs. Curd's hand, a fleeting narrowing of the eyes, and a careful, almost imperceptible adjustment of her posture indicated that she was guarding knowledge that she deemed sensitive. Not enough to accuse her outright, yet sufficient for Miss Marple to file away the behavior as a thread of potential significance. By evening, the cumulative effect of these minor events weighed on Miss Marple's mind. The anonymous letter, the disturbed tablecloth, the faintly nervous behaviors, all suggested that the orchestrator of Basil Langley's death was conscious of the investigative attention, clever enough to exploit distraction, and aware of the predictable patterns of those around them. The revelation that someone had interacted with the scene after the crime added a layer of deception she had not initially anticipated. Miss Marple, settling by her fire, reflected on the subtleties at play. The murderer was not brute or rash, but meticulous and patient, exploiting the ordinary assumptions of civility to execute a concealed act. Yet the psychological imprints of their actions, the slight tremors, hesitations, and adjustments, offered faint, almost imperceptible windows into their motives and methods. Every observation she had made over the past days now coalesced, guiding her toward the understanding that the truth was embedded not in the dramatic, but in the quiet, often overlooked gestures of those around her. The village, for all its calm, was now alive with these subtle tensions. Miss Marple sensed that the forthcoming revelations would emerge from the ordinary, from the habitual behaviors of the inhabitants, and from the delicate unraveling of carefully maintained facades. A second twist had arrived, not in the form of new violence, but as a psychological puzzle, a test of attention, perception, and understanding of human nature. And it was within these observations, she knew with quiet certainty, that the path to the murderer would soon be revealed. Miss Marple, with her customary quiet deliberation, decided it was time to engage the villagers more directly, not through overt questioning, which might provoke defensiveness, but through gentle, seemingly casual conversation designed to observe reactions. She understood that human nature, when subtly probed, often revealed truths far more reliably than any rigid interrogation. That afternoon, she began with Lady Brabazon, whose pride in her garden and social standing was matched only by her sensitivity to criticism. Seated in the drawing room, Miss Marple complimented the careful arrangement of the flowers and the precision of the garden paths, letting her remarks drift toward the events of the party itself. "I was thinking," she said, almost idly, "how people's habits often betray them when they least expect it. One can be most clever in arranging appearances, yet miss the smallest detail that gives away intent." Lady Brabazon's hands tightened briefly around her teacup, a subtle, yet telling movement. She smiled politely, but the slight furrow of her brow suggested a flicker of unease. Miss Marple noted it carefully, cataloging it as part of the wider puzzle. Next, she visited Mrs. Penelope Curd, ostensibly to discuss the care of her prized roses. The conversation meandered toward the garden party, and Miss Marple allowed her to recount the sequence of serving the drinks. At one point, Miss Marple remarked softly, "It is fascinating how even the most minor arrangements can conceal intentions, isn't it?" Mrs. Curd paused, a flicker of hesitation crossing her face, as though she had considered her answer too carefully. Miss Marple's sharp mind cataloged the reaction, aware that a well-timed prompt could reveal far more than direct questioning ever could. She then arranged a brief, informal tea at her own cottage, inviting a small group of villagers, including Emily Pritchard and Mr. Wilkins. The gathering was under the guise of social civility. Yet Miss Marple steered the conversation towards subtle topics: the sequence of events at the garden party, the nature of Basil Langley's habits, and the behaviors of those present. Each remark was measured, designed to evoke microreactions, twitches of the fingers, brief shifts of posture, faint changes in tone. These small cues, invisible to most, were rich with insight for one as observant as Miss Marple. Emily, though initially tense, relaxed over the course of the afternoon, speaking freely of the pressures she had felt from Basil Langley. Her relief was evident, her gestures open and unguarded, confirming Miss Marple's earlier understanding that she bore no culpable intent. Mr. Wilkins displayed anxiety as expected, but it was a nervousness born of embarrassment over debts, not of a calculated act of murder. The most telling reactions came from Mrs. Curd and Lady Brabazon. Mrs. Curd, when asked casually about minor details, who had poured the sherry first, which glass had been closest to Mr. Langley, hesitated ever so slightly, her gaze flickering toward the windows and doors as if ensuring no one else was observing. Lady Brabazon, for her part, maintained outward composure. Yet her careful monitoring of the behavior of others betrayed a degree of involvement in minute household matters that suggested familiarity with manipulating events behind the scenes. Miss Marple, noting these subtleties, allowed her mind to piece together the emerging pattern. The murderer was meticulous, socially astute, and aware of human distractions. They relied not on overt action but on careful orchestration and timing, exploiting the natural assumptions of civility to conceal their intentions. It was a psychological exercise as much as a physical one, demanding foresight, patience, and a knowledge of those around them. As the evening drew on, Miss Marple reflected on the delicate interplay of behaviors she had observed. Each hesitant glance, each micro-adjustment, and each fleeting flicker of tension offered a clue. The villagers, unwittingly, had revealed themselves through the patterns of their ordinary actions. And the truth was hidden not in dramatic confession, but in the subtle, often overlooked gestures that accompanied social interaction. She understood now that the final step in her investigation would require a careful, deliberate test, an engagement designed to provoke the necessary response from the guilty party without alerting them to her suspicions. This test would rely upon her deep understanding of human nature, patience, and the art of suggestion, allowing the perpetrator to expose themselves through the very behaviors they sought to control. By the time Miss Marple returned home, night had settled over St. Mary Mead, and the village streets lay quiet beneath a soft, silver glow of moonlight. The threads of suspicion had been gently tugged and observed, and the contours of the murderer's personality had begun to emerge with remarkable clarity. All that remained was to orchestrate the subtle confrontation that would draw out the truth, revealing the hand that had so carefully concealed a lethal act beneath the veneer of a midsummer garden party. Miss Marple knew the moment had arrived to act with quiet precision. She invited the key villagers to her cottage once more, under the pretext of a small social gathering. The drawing room was arranged with the casual charm that only she could create, and tea was served in her usual, unobtrusive manner. She watched each guest carefully, noting the way hands trembled over teacups, the subtle avoidance of eye contact, and the barely perceptible tightening of posture when certain topics arose. These were the signs she had been waiting for, the behavioral cues that would allow her to unmask the orchestrator of Basil Langley's death. Her opening was gentle, almost conversational. "It is remarkable," she remarked as she poured tea, "how small details can carry more truth than the loudest declarations. A misplaced glass, a slight hesitation, even the manner in which one stirs tea, so many things can reveal what the mind is concealing." The guests murmured in agreement, some nervously, some dismissively, yet each comment was a probe, a carefully constructed nudge to observe the reactions it produced. Emily Pritchard, as expected, relaxed in her chair, responding with genuine candor to Miss Marple's observations. Mr. Wilkins remained anxious but honest, his discomfort rooted in social embarrassment rather than guilt. It was Mrs. Penelope Curd and Lady Brabazon who drew Miss Marple's attention most sharply. Mrs. Curd, attempting to maintain her usual garrulous composure, betrayed subtle signs of over-control, fingers drumming a rapid, uneven rhythm on the table, a slight tilt of the head as though calculating how to respond, a barely perceptible sigh when attention strayed elsewhere. Lady Brabazon, by contrast, exuded calmness, yet her eyes flicked frequently toward her own hands, checking their position and adjusting the angle of her wrists in a manner too deliberate to be accidental. Miss Marple continued her conversation with deft subtlety, recounting details from the garden party in a neutral tone. She spoke of the sequence of serving drinks, the placement of glasses, and the habits of the deceased, phrases chosen carefully to observe the micro-expressions that might betray inner knowledge or guilt. As she described the small, irregular stain on the tablecloth where the sherry had been poured, Mrs. Curd stiffened slightly, a response almost imperceptible to the untrained eye, but vivid to Miss Marple. Lady Brabazon's lips pressed together momentarily, the faintest narrowing of her eyes signaling a calculated assessment of the situation. Then, Miss Marple shifted her attention to the psychological aspect, remarking lightly, "It is fascinating how some individuals can orchestrate an event so subtly that everyone assumes accident, while in reality, the outcome has been carefully designed. One's understanding of human habits can be as lethal as any weapon." She allowed the comment to linger, observing the flickers of recognition in the eyes of those present at that moment. The pattern Miss Marple had been following crystallized. Mrs. Curd, the seemingly harmless gossiper, had both access and opportunity, but her nervous responses were inconsistent with the meticulous precision of the act itself. Lady Brabazon, the proud, socially dominant figure, displayed the calm, measured control necessary to manipulate events without detection. Her knowledge of the guests' behaviors, her awareness of procedural assumptions, and her subtle psychological maneuvering aligned perfectly with the careful orchestration required to deliver the fatal act unnoticed. Miss Marple allowed a silence to fall. Then, with an unassuming tone, said, "It appears the one most confident in the predictability of human nature is also the one most capable of guiding outcomes to suit their design." Lady Brabazon's hand stilled, her composure maintained, yet her eyes betrayed the flicker of surprise and acknowledgement that Miss Marple had anticipated. "Indeed, my dear Lady Brabazon," Miss Marple continued, her voice calm but firm. "The fall of Basil Langley was no accident, and the small details everyone else overlooked were precisely the ones that revealed intent. The placement of the glasses, the careful timing, and the reliance on the predictable habits of others all point to someone intimately familiar with both the setting and the people present." Lady Brabazon's serene mask wavered, if only slightly, and in that instant, the truth emerged without confrontation or accusation. Her meticulous pride, her careful orchestration, and the subtle psychological maneuvers she had executed over the course of the gathering made her culpability unmistakable. Miss Marple's eyes, gentle yet penetrating, met hers and conveyed the certainty of her deduction. The room, though silent, was charged with understanding. The other villagers, still unaware of the full scope, felt the weight of Miss Marple's calm authority, recognizing that the mystery had been resolved not by force or drama, but by the quiet art of observation and insight into human nature. The final test, subtle as it had been, had revealed all that was necessary. The murderer's own understanding of psychology had, ironically, betrayed them entirely. The revelation settled over St. Mary Mead like the gentle hush of an autumn evening, quiet yet unmistakable. Lady Brabazon, confronted by Miss Marple's subtle deductions, had admitted to her role with a mixture of reluctant pride and feigned embarrassment, acknowledging that her understanding of human behavior had allowed her to execute the fatal act with precision. The villagers, who had long speculated and whispered, now grasped the truth. Though the intricacies of her plan, so reliant on timing, observation, and exploitation of ordinary habits, remained almost astonishing in their subtlety, Inspector Davis, who had maintained a steady, procedural approach throughout, listened with respectful attention as Miss Marple recounted her method, She explained the small, seemingly inconsequential details that had gone unnoticed. The precise positioning of the sherry glasses, the small irregular stain on the tablecloth, the sequence of service, and the manner in which each guest's natural behavior had been exploited. Each point fit seamlessly into the narrative, creating a logical chain from motive to opportunity, from method to outcome. The inspector nodded, impressed, though he could not conceal a hint of relief that the resolution lay in observation rather than further tragedy. The villagers, for their part, processed the revelation with a mixture of shock, admiration, and unease. Emily Pritchard, now fully exonerated, felt an immense relief and, in her gratitude, approached Miss Marple with warm sincerity. "I cannot thank you enough," she said. "I feared suspicion would linger indefinitely. You have restored not only justice but peace of mind." Miss Marple smiled gently, replying that it was merely a matter of careful observation and patience, a reassurance that human nature, though complex, often revealed itself to those willing to watch quietly and attentively. Mr. Wilkins, though still anxious about his financial affairs, expressed relief as well. The tension that had gripped him since the garden party eased now that the true source of the tragedy had been identified. Even Lady Brabazon, though facing the inevitable consequences of her actions, seemed almost serene, as though the act of confession had lightened the burden she had carried. Miss Marple noted the subtle human capacity for both remorse and composure, understanding that acknowledgement of wrongdoing was sometimes as powerful as any legal resolution that in the days that followed. The village gradually returned to its usual rhythms, though with a quiet, reflective undertone. Conversation resumed in the tea rooms and along the streets, but always with a heightened awareness of the complexities that lay beneath everyday interactions. Miss Marple, as ever, continued her walks through the village paths, observing life as it unfolded, children chasing after one another, neighbors exchanging greetings. The ordinary bustle of rural existence interwoven with the knowledge that beneath polite facades, human motives could be intricate, subtle, and occasionally dangerous. The psychological lessons of the case remained vivid to her. The importance of observation over assumption, of patience over hasty judgment, and of understanding the delicate interplay of habit, pride, and fear. In the quiet of her sitting room, Miss Marple reflected on how the fatal act had relied not on brute force or violence, but on the exploitation of ordinary social expectations, the predictable gestures, polite distractions, and habitual behaviors that shaped the lives of everyone involved. In that subtlety lay both the crime and its solution. Even the more vocal villagers, who had eagerly speculated on motives and gossip, began to appreciate the complexity of human behavior in ways they had not considered before. Small kindnesses, hesitations, nervous gestures, and careful calculations could reveal more than any overt statement. Miss Marple's insight had transformed not only the outcome of the investigation, but also the village's awareness of the nuanced truths that lay hidden in plain sight. As the sun set over St. Mary Mead, casting long, golden shadows across the lanes and gardens, Miss Marple sat quietly by the window, tea in hand, content in the knowledge that justice had been served. The village would carry on, the social fabric intact though subtly altered by the events of the past days. And as she watched the familiar routines resume, she considered the enduring lesson that beneath the calm surface of ordinary life, the human heart contained both kindness and cunning, and that careful observation, patience, and empathy were the keys to unraveling even the most cunning of schemes that in the end, peace had returned, not in ignorance, but in understanding. And Miss Marple, ever composed, reflected on the extraordinary truth that sometimes the most subtle details, the quietest gestures, and the softest observations were enough to illuminate even the darkest of intentions, restoring order and revealing the complexities of human nature with gentle, unerring clarity. The days following Lady Brabazon's confession brought a quiet, reflective air over St. Mary Mead, but Miss Marple knew that the resolution of the crime, while legally complete, had yet to be fully assimilated by the community. People resumed their routines, yet subtle shifts in behavior revealed the lingering impact of the garden party's tragic events. Even in ordinary interactions, glances held a weight previously absent, Conversations were tinged with a cautious honesty, and civility carried an undercurrent of observation. Miss Marple found these changes as instructive as any clue. She spent her mornings walking the familiar paths, observing the small gestures of villagers as they resumed their lives. Children played with innocent abandon in the village green, their laughter ringing freely, but she noticed how parents' eyes lingered a little longer on them, a subtle wariness tempered by relief. The post office reopened fully, the chatter of neighbors now interlaced with careful curiosity rather than idle gossip, while at the tea rooms, polite discussion included a conscious awareness of human behavior, an acknowledgement that beneath the ordinary, complexity often resided. Emily Pritchard, now free from suspicion, moved with an ease she had not possessed during the tense days of investigation. She approached Miss Marple one morning with a small bouquet of wildflowers, her gesture unassuming yet heartfelt. "Your insight brought clarity where we saw only confusion," she said. Miss Marple smiled gently, replying that observation, patience, and understanding the natural tendencies of people often revealed more than hurried assumptions ever could. Emily's relief and gratitude reflected not only her innocence, but also the reassurance the village had collectively received. Justice had been quietly, yet fully, restored. Mr. Wilkins, too, displayed a noticeable lightness of spirit. While his financial concerns remained, the tension that had gripped him since the garden party had eased. He moved with less hesitation, spoke with a newfound openness, and even ventured tentative humor during conversation. Miss Marple recognized in his demeanor the subtle power of resolution. When the true source of fear and anxiety is identified, human behavior relaxes, revealing authenticity and ease once more. Lady Brabazon, though facing the inevitable consequences of her actions, displayed a composed dignity. The confession had been both an acknowledgement of wrongdoing and a release from the burden of concealment. Miss Marple observed her from a distance, noting the careful maintenance of composure and the quiet acceptance that came with the understanding that the truth, when illuminated, allowed for at least the moral clarity, if not the comfort, of accountability. The village, in its collective consciousness, had absorbed the lessons of the past weeks. People now spoke of the importance of attentiveness to small details, of the subtle dynamics of human interaction, and of the care required when judging motives and actions. Miss Marple found this quietly satisfying, for it meant that the social fabric, though tested, had been strengthened. Awareness had replaced idle speculation, and understanding had tempered the inevitable shock of tragedy. In her own home, Miss Marple reflected on the case with her customary calm. She considered how the smallest behaviors, hesitations, glances, gestures, and habits had combined to reveal intentions far more clearly than overt statements or assumptions ever could. Human nature, in all its complexity, had both concealed and illuminated the truth. The genius of the crime lay in its subtlety. The genius of its unraveling lay in the patient, attentive observation of everyday life. As twilight descended, casting a warm glow across St. Mary Mead, the village streets regained their gentle rhythm. Shopkeepers closed their windows with casual attention. Neighbors exchanged greetings with an ease restored by clarity. And the ordinary sounds of life, footsteps on cobblestones, the ringing of church bells, the distant laughter of children, wove together into a reassuring cadence. Miss Marple sat by her window, tea in hand, reflecting on the events that had passed. The garden party, the death of Basil Langley, the careful orchestration, and the ultimate revelation all illustrated a singular truth. Beneath the polite facades of daily life, human nature reveals itself in the smallest, quietest moments, and in that realization lay the enduring lesson: patience, observation, and understanding are more powerful than haste, suspicion, or the loudest declarations. The village had endured a subtle but profound lesson in morality, psychology, and civility, and in the gentle unfolding of these truths, Miss Marple recognized the quiet restoration not only of justice, but of harmony. St. Mary Mead, serene once more, carried forward the knowledge that the ordinary can conceal the extraordinary, and that careful attention, soft, persistent, and perceptive, is often the most decisive force in uncovering it.